I was recently talking with a client and she said she has a rule that she doesn't answer her phone after 6 p.m. It's family time, right? It's good. But recently at work, there's been some urgent issues that have arisen.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's started getting calls from her boss in the evening time. And she's like, I can't not answer the phone because I know there are all these things happening and they need my help and it's my boss and I can't just
Yeah.
ignore that. So I have to answer. But now she's kind of torn between enforcing a boundary
Mhm.
and adjusting for those times when maybe she needs to make an exception. She's just wrestling with all of this. How do I do this? How do I have a boundary but make an exception? Is it still a boundary? This kind of a thing.
Yes.
So yeah, we've all been there. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. Today, we have a special guest with us. Dr. Amanda Cassil is a licensed clinical psychologist, author, and speaker. She is the founder of STEM Psychological Services, which offers therapy to women and underrepresented minorities in STEM fields, including science, technology, engineering, and math. Dr. Cassil is also the author of The Empowered Highly Sensitive Person and the Self-Care Plan for the Highly Sensitive Person. Dr. Cassil, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited about this conversation.
Pumped to be here.
Yay.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Okay, let's get started since I know we have quite a bit to cover today. Just so our audience knows, we are going to cover 5 different topics today around emotional health and well-being and managing our mental health in the workplace. We're going to provide examples that many of you have probably experienced, along with practical takeaways and tips that you can use immediately to help you navigate these situations. Our first topic is imposter syndrome. And I have personally battled imposter syndrome for what feels like my entire life, but certainly throughout my career, and more specifically in the years since I've been building my own business. And I'm just a master at not giving myself enough credit or comparing myself to other people, which results in this belief that what I have or what I've accomplished isn't really a result of my own efforts. And that can get kind of dicey. And actually, I recently had a situation where I was sharing with someone about a book that I had the opportunity to co-author. And their response to me was, oh, wow, you really got lucky. And if I hadn't have done all of this work on imposter syndrome and recognized it in my own mind, I probably would have believed them, which is wild because there was definitely a lot that went into landing a deal with like that. So my question for you is, many of us are familiar with imposter syndrome, but sometimes its effect can be tricky to recognize in our day-to-day situations. It can kind of creep in on us. So what are some common signs that our feelings are a result of imposter syndrome? And what actions can we take to start mitigating it?
So imposter syndrome, it is, like we said, very sneaky, but it's ultimately a self-doubt in your own skill, ability, intellect, achievements, which you just described really well. And it comes from this place of constant comparison. So we're always looking at other people and then kind of judging where we are less than, which is pretty exhausting. And when we often feel less than, that's going to lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. And the tricky piece with imposter syndrome is you may already be someone who's prone to those things. So I am naturally prone to anxiety, then I start having imposter syndrome. Well, which one came first? And so it's not always easy to tell. And that can be a bit of a chicken or the egg situation. But one of the things that often shows up with it and can sort of prime our brains to start thinking that way is feeling like an outsider. And this can happen for a number of reasons. But when your brain is primed to see yourself as an outsider, then it becomes like the data supports that conclusion already, rather than looking for other conclusions that we might be able to draw. And so it's also a consideration, for example, in STEM fields, women, underrepresented minorities often feel like they don't belong because they don't fit in with everybody else. So there are pieces that can be factual and sort of concrete evidence where we're like, see, I don't belong. And it can be so confusing to try to tease those out. What's real? What's in my head? How do I navigate that world. And so usually when I talk with people about imposter syndrome, we're talking both about the internal factors, like what am I bringing to the table here? My biases, my preconceived ideas, my past experiences, maybe that have primed me this way. And then also external factors. In competitive fields, you can often get very explicit messages that you don't belong. Whether that's, you're a diversity hire, that's a common one. That's a really hurtful thing to say to anybody.
Yeah.
Saying that your book was lucky, that's a very strong statement to make to someone that you don't really know what all went behind that. And so we want to be thinking from both of those angles when we're thinking about stepping in and making changes. So for things that are more internal, we can do kind of classic cognitive behavioral work, start working on that comparison mindset, reframing our automatic negative thoughts, challenging some of our assumptions. And then something that is a fun way to kind of come at this is to start working on your sense of identity outside of your career, right? So if I have confidence in who I am in other settings, if I can build successes in other areas, then my identity in this career with this title feels less fragile. So when somebody starts to poke at it, it's less disruptive because I know who I am. I know who supports me. I know why I'm here. It's less. But when everything we do is work, then when people start to attack that, it feels like my whole world is crumbling.
So personal. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's your identity, like
Yeah.
you said. Um, yeah, something that has really helped me is you mentioned comparison. And I'm also a master at comparing myself to other people.
Oh,
That's
and we always lose.
yeah,
Unless you're a narcissist, then you can win.
so it's like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to measure up because there's always someone that is a few steps ahead and who knows what they've gone through or what their circumstances have been like. And one thing that's really helped me is to every time I notice that I'm doing that, to stop. The only person I need to compare myself to is myself. Like
Mhm.
there's no person that has had my life experiences with my brain and my all of this that I should be comparing myself to.
Yeah, we all start with a different set of resources and challenges. So how far we get, what path we're even on is different for each of us. And so I think of comparison as has a really minimal use, right? So if I'm running a marathon, looking up and seeing where everybody else is, it's really only helpful just to make sure I'm on the right track. Okay, like, so what's the next step? It's that turn around the corner up there. Great, that's what I'm working on. How far I am in comparison to other people is really not helpful. And so it's sort of like, am I in the pack? Am I in the direction that I want to be going? Great, stop the comparison and put your attention elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, another really helpful thing I think for everyone to have in their toolkit is is a mentor who's possibly, just a few steps ahead of you, kind of doing what you're doing in that same realm, someone that you trust and feel safe with that can help guide you along that journey, but is also someone who really, very closely understands what it is you're doing and why you're trying to get there.
Yes.
I think that's been another critical thing for me to have as I'm building my business, a
Yeah.
mentor, actually lots of mentors, because we can't do it alone.
We can't. And we need people who we trust to speak into those things, and who understand our goals. So your mentor shouldn't be guiding you on their goals and what they think is best, but on your own goals. Um, and that can be sometimes hard to find, but if you look for it, if you ask around for it, there are people who are often willing to give feedback in a formal mentorship or an informal setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah. Just
think
ask.
with the comparison too, there's a sense of what are your goals? And they may be different than somebody else's goals. And some people will be like, well, no, we have the same goals. Well, I mean, maybe in a certain subset, like what are their goals with their family, with their life outside of work, with you don't know what their financial situation is. There's so many things that we don't know about other people. And so we fill those in when we're making comparisons in a way that we know all the details about ourselves. And so it's kind of that like social media syndrome where
Yes.
they all look so happy. Well, yeah, but you don't see everything that's going on behind the camera or when the
Yes.
lights fade. Yeah.
I just said that to someone the other day. I was like, wow, you look so happy in that picture. And they said, actually, my life was kind of falling apart at that moment. And I
Mhm.
thought, okay, it kind of took a step back and had to check myself because I think the comparison thing was starting
Yeah.
to kick in without even really knowing it. You know, the other thing you mentioned that resonated with me was challenging your own assumptions,
Yeah.
challenging uh, why am I thinking this way? Or why do I have this thought? Is it true? I think that's the biggest question for me is this true? And if so, what is supporting this truth? A lot of what goes through my
Yeah.
mind is actually not truth when I'm thinking about myself. Like it's not
Isn't that
true.
wild? But if we feel it, then it feels true.
Yeah.
And that's a very tricky thing with emotions. If I feel upset about this, it must be categorically an upsetting thing. And every person may experience that thing differently, which can be confusing and send us on a whole journey. But fact checking and looking at things like what do I know to be true? Well, I have written this book. Like that is factual. And whether the opportunity or who you met or whatever, there's a lot of things in life that are lucky, but we also have to work really hard to capitalize on that luck when it appears. And
Yeah.
whatever the circumstances, like writing a book is very hard. And so good for you. That's
Thank you.
incredible. Yeah. But that is something that it's easy to minimize the things that we do. And then we look at somebody else who wrote a book and it's like, oh, that's amazing. And it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, feel that way about yourself. That's the same thing.
I was actually thinking that as I read your intro. And I was thinking, wow, she's so accomplished. Look at the books and all these things. So interesting.
It's we use very different metrics for ourselves than we use for other people. And it's unfair. And it's even if we can level the metrics and make them fair, it's still not helpful. Doesn't move us anywhere productive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that wraps up imposter syndrome.
Awesome.
Let's move on. Let's move
We've
on
solved
to the
it.
second one. We have so many good things that we're covering. I was looking through our list and just like, wow, we're doing it all
We are.
in
We're
this session.
ambitious.
Okay. Topic number 2 is boundaries,
Mm,
which is one of my favorite topics in life, but specifically with work, it can get a little murky. And
it's hard.
actually, it's hard. Yeah. And in so many conversations that I have with people I'm coaching or project managers I'm speaking with, the issues that we discuss revolve around boundaries, whether it's explicitly stated or not. Like these are a lot
Yes.
of the challenges that we're experiencing in the workplace. And it's tricky because even if we have a boundary, life doesn't happen in black and white. There's a lot of gray area. And so sometimes the boundaries maybe don't play out like we thought they would. And so, yeah, I was recently talking with a client and she said she has a rule that she doesn't answer her phone after 6 p.m. You know, it's family time, right? It's good. But recently at work, there's been some urgent issues that have arisen.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's started getting calls from her boss in the evening time. And she's like, I can't not answer the phone because I know there are all these things happening and they need my help and it's my boss and I can't just
Yeah.
ignore that. So I have to answer. But now she's kind of torn between enforcing a boundary
Mhm.
and adjusting for those times when maybe she needs to make an exception. She's just wrestling with all of this. How do I do this? How do I have a boundary but make an exception? Is it still a boundary? This kind of a thing.
Yes.
So yeah, we've all been there.
It's so
So
hard
my
because one of
question for
oh,
you is, oh,
no. I was just gonna jump in. Go for it.
yeah. My question for you is, Setting and enforcing boundaries can be difficult, like we just said. At times it's nuanced. So, what best practices can we incorporate into our boundary setting to ensure appropriate boundaries at work while also allowing for that flexibility and understanding when gray area arises?
Yes, it's it's so tough. And one of the things that I appreciate in your example is it brings forward this very complicated dynamic of power differentials, right? Because if I'm setting a boundary with a peer, we're not splitting the power. There's no retaliation that might happen if I set a boundary. I mean, people can always retaliate, but I'm not stuck in that position. And when we are in positions that we need, like work for income, that power differential starts to shift how we engage our boundaries. And so we can't always control that, but we can try to be mindful of it so that we make informed decisions. Because regardless of how stuck we are, we do have some agency in how we move forward. I know some people don't like that mindset because it's like, well, I still have to work. It's like, you do have the option of leaving. It is always it comes with severe consequences, but it is an option. And when you have in your mind that I have options, it shifts your ability to engage the process. Because if you have no options, we tend to go into sort of a learned helplessness role.
Mm.
What's the point? But if we have options of like, I am doing this
Yeah,
because I
it
need
takes
money.
us. Yeah, I could see thinking more like a victim when
Mhm.
we feel like I'm powerless or there's nothing.
Yeah,
I mean, it might be the word to use, but you just feel like you're helpless, you're powerless. But if we give
yeah.
ourselves options, even if they aren't the option that we want to take or the first
Sometimes
option,
they're terrible options.
yeah.
But having some sense of agency in how you respond gives us sort of a rock we can build on.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so that's something that can be helpful to keep in mind is reframing like I am choosing to stay in this terrible situation because I love my family, because I want to eat, because I like having shelter. Those are sad realities, but they are choices. And then we say, like, okay, if this is my reality, how do I move myself forward into something different? And we have to sometimes be very scrappy and resilient, even though we don't want to be. Um, so that wasn't where I planned on starting, but I do think that's a helpful mentality to bring in is
Mhm.
find where you have a choice. Uh, and then, I mean, as a therapist, I'm always going to promote empathy. So as we're building skills around boundary settings, it's very easy for us to be somewhat aggressive, especially if you're more sensitive, you're more shy. This is like a new muscle, and so we try to like do it and do it well so that people hear us. Sometimes it comes across in ways we don't intend, that it might be more sharp or hurtful. And so having some empathy towards yourself, some compassion that like this is hard, this is a new skill I'm building, so I'm not going to do it really well. But I am working to protect something that's valuable to me, right? Our boundaries serve to protect us and the things that we care about, the people we care about. And then we can also bring in empathy for the other person. Because a lot of people are not intentionally trying to push boundaries. Some are. But when we respond harshly, we sort of shut down the conversation and we don't necessarily get a clear indication of where they're coming from or what's going on. So if we start in empathy, we can sort of gather more useful data that informs how we want to set this boundary, what we want to do. When we're empathic, especially for highly sensitive people, it can be easy to slip into not having boundaries. So we try to like shut our empathy off so that we can hold this boundary. So what I'm proposing is we try to hold both at the same time. So this can be harder if in the past you've been in relationships where your no's are not respected. That starts to train us that, oh, well, I tried and it's not going to work. Or when we're so attuned to the emotions of other people that when they feel anger or disappointment or frustration, I feel like I need to fix it.
Mm.
So then I move into like making the other person feel better. And that's not good for you. That leads to resentment and a lot of problems in the relationship. But it's also not good for them because they may not know that that's what's going on for you. And people can handle feeling sad, disappointed, and frustrated. That's a healthy thing for an adult to be able to tolerate.
Mhm.
So when I talk about empathy, it's not removing negative emotion from other people, but it's more of a cognitive empathy of holding space that they are allowed to feel how they need to feel. Because when I say no, when I set a boundary, they're likely going to have feelings and reactions, and they are allowed to experience that. That doesn't mean I have to change my answer, but I can hold it. So an example like this, I did a peer, because it's a little easier, but maybe I should think power differential. So with the boss, saying if he calls and it's not related to this emergency, that might be a good time to say like, oh, I'm sorry, I thought this was part of the emergency. It sounds like maybe this could be something that can wait until tomorrow. Would that be okay? I try to save time after 6 o'clock for my family.
Mhm.
In that, there's more of an explanation, which generally I say if you're holding a boundary and you don't want to change it, you don't need an explanation because that opens it up to negotiate. When there's a power differential, it's a way of showing respect to your boss, of saying like, this is my logic. I'm open to feedback if we need to negotiate something new, which you may or may not feel is true for you in that situation. But it's not, it's so much harder with a power differential. And I think this is why people really struggle at work. And I see this a lot in Gen Z of being like, these are my boundaries. And the older generations being like, okay, well, then you're not going to get promoted, you're not going to get a raise, and you're not likely going to stay here for very long. And
Yeah.
so if we're so rigid that it shuts down conversation, that may not be good for us in the long run. If we're too flexible, like if she just starts taking calls after 6 o'clock every day, like that's going to impact her family life. It's going to lead to burnout. It's going to cause probably some anxiety, a harder time falling asleep at night. There's a lot of kind of knock-on effects that then fall when we start flexing our boundaries. And so it's really important for us to understand what our boundaries are, being able to label like, why do I have this boundary? So that we can communicate it not only to other people if we have to, but to have a clear understanding of ourselves. When is this worth flexing? When is it worth negotiating something new? And then how do I want to do that? And so it takes some mindful reflection of, I don't like this is not a very helpful boundary to hold. I don't like working after 6. Well, I mean, most of us don't like working generally. So how does that differ? But if it is I'm an hourly employee, I work 8 to 5, and when you contact me after work, I don't get paid for that. That's a pretty solid reason to have a firm no.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can be situational because I had someone else I was speaking to where it was a situation like you just expressed, where
Mhm.
the boundary was already in place by nature of the type of work arrangement that they had.
Yes.
So that's an easy one to be like, well, I don't have to answer the call because I've literally clocked out.
Yeah.
But when you're at that, a higher director level and you're
Yes.
trying to establish these boundaries, it can be a little gray. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that I was hoping we would have,
Yeah.
because boundaries are not clear. And so often we want them to just be like, yes, no, black and white. But when you actually put them into practice in life, that can be quite disappointing, because
Yes.
that's not how life is. It doesn't turn out like that. And these conversations around how to have healthy boundaries and enforce them flexibly when needed. I loved your suggestion about backing it up with logic, like just kind of
Mhm.
pulling it back to that. Is this part of the emergency? If it's not,
Yeah.
then can we wait until tomorrow to discuss it? That's perfect, because
Yeah. If
how
it
could
is,
you?
I'm open to it. Like I'm
Yeah,
not
I'm
shutting you
open to
down.
it. I would love to help with this issue.
Yeah.
It's just not an emergency. So let's wait until tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and there's different types of boundaries too. I think
Mhm.
there are those ones where it's like, I would like to not work after 6 p.m. Okay. But then there are other boundaries that are more serious, I
Yeah.
guess, right? Like
Like if I don't leave by 3:30, I can't pick up my child. That's
I
a
can't pick up
common one that
yeah,
people have. Yeah.
yeah. So we have to consider that
Yeah.
as well. It's like, what are the things that I would like in my life? And then what are the things that are necessary for me to have to be able to take care of myself and my family? And how do I balance all of that?
Yes. And that's where, if you are someone who is in leadership, what you do models to everybody else what acceptable boundaries are. So even just having conversations around like, these are the expectations, these are the norms of how we communicate, this is when it's okay to turn your phone off and not respond to email. If you are higher up the ladder and you are doing work late into the night because you're like, well, it's my company and I need to, can you set those things up to auto send at 8 a.m. the next day so that no one's getting messages that like, boss is up at 2 a.m. Am I supposed to also be aware of what's going on at 2 a.m.? I hope not. If you are, you should probably be getting paid more.
Yeah, and it,
um,
it it creates that culture too
yeah,
of round the clock working
yeah.
and just all of that stuff that everyone's trying to move away from. I think it was interesting how you mentioned empathy and dropping the boundaries. And I historically have been the one that's like, I'll drop my boundaries first.
Mhm.
Like that's, I'll be the one
Yes.
to do that so we can work until 2 a.m. or whatever. I will do that. But the older I've gotten, the
Yeah,
more experience that I've had as well. And just like you mentioned, working in leadership, we have to be really careful about that. I mean, I would never advise someone to drop all their boundaries to make other people happy. So why would I do that?
it's a recipe for disaster.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then I think too, if you have the bandwidth for it, working on managing your own emotions, because when we feel like our boundary has been crossed, we get angry, we get sad, we get hurt. Those are reasonable reactions. How you navigate those in the workplace can be challenging, which I think we touch on emotions in the workplace a little later. Um, but we also, so being able to have kind of conversations that we can deal with the meat of it and not get distracted by the emotion. And everybody is different on where they can tolerate those levels. Um, but we have to allow other people to have different boundaries than us. So if I'm setting really firm boundaries and then somebody sets a really firm one with me, they're allowed to do that. It may
Yeah.
feel weird, but that can be an empathy learning point of like, yeah, it probably feels weird for other people when you set boundaries too. That's okay. This is part of how we live in society and have healthy dynamics with people. And then we also have to accept that some of our boundaries come with consequences. Not having boundaries also comes with consequences, but there is just fallout from every choice that we make. Things we miss out on, um, things that we wish people didn't have to experience. But when we say no, we may miss out on things. Like if you do need, if you're going up for promotion and they need somebody who can be available in the evenings when there's different shifts working, and you're someone that has a hard out at 6, you may not be the first person that comes to mind when they want to look at promoting, even if you are technically the most skilled. And so
Yeah.
those can be painful things. And that's where, again, we go back to, what is this boundary? Why am I holding it? And then how am I communicating it with people at work? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So good. So good. Like I said, boundaries is one of my favorites.
I love
We
it.
could,
And I think negotiating boundaries too can be, if you and the other person can be like regulated in how you're communicating your emotions, you can find really creative solutions to things. If both people can say, these are my limits, these are my limits, can we find something that works? Beautiful.
yes.
It's wonderful.
I love it. I love it. Okay. Moving on. Now we're going to talk about feedback. Feedback.
Yeah.
Um, This is a big one because it involves communicating and communicating information that's, sometimes less than savory, either being the one
Mhm.
that is delivering that information or the one that's receiving it. And I've been on both sides of this. I've been the one that delivered the feedback and maybe didn't give it in the most appropriate way because I didn't want to hurt feelings.
Mhm.
So it wasn't really a helpful situation, right?
Yeah.
I've also been on the receiving end of feedback that was kind of abrasive and made me feel like I just was kind of worthless and didn't know how to even become better. So been on both sides of it. And my question for you is, as leaders, communicating honestly and effectively to the teams that we manage is obviously critical to achieving results. But it's easier said than done.
Yes.
What are some ways we can ensure honest and beneficial delivery of feedback while also considering feelings and sensitivities of others? And do you have any specific words or phrases that we could keep in mind when we're having these conversations?
Yes. Yes. So one of the places I like to start is with this concept of non-judgmental awareness. So coming at our understanding of a situation, of our behavior, what we're producing, that comes from a non-judgmental space. Um, because research shows us that when we get critical or harsh feedback, like when you said you felt worthless, that shuts down the parts of our brain that are in charge of working or of learning. Sorry. It shuts down our prefrontal cortex. This is where like our executive functioning, our higher level thinking is, and we kind of need that to be improving our work skills, to be navigating complex challenges and problem solving, etc. It moves us into a very defensive position where we sort of shut down and want to protect, and it fills us with shame and embarrassment,
Mhm.
which really, those are so counterproductive to getting your employees to improve. So when you have direct reports coming to you, we want to be presenting information in a way that they can digest so that they take it and go be productive with it. And so in that vein, if we start to replace words that we tend to associate with our core value as a human, so words like bad, weak, those are our common feedback terms, like you're not doing well on this. We tend to take that in as attack that's personal. Not everybody does, but a lot of people do. And so if we can start to move away from things that we can take in as personal, then it starts to change the problem from something with us, I'm bad at my job, into maybe a problem that I'm approaching. So this is external to me, it's not part of my identity, but what I'm doing isn't working. So how do I change my approach in a way that moves us more toward the goal of what I'm trying to do? That's a very empowering mindset to be in. Um, it gives us space for growth as we're thinking, and it starts to separate us from the problem that we're dealing with. So phrases that I prefer are things like helpful, unhelpful.
Okay.
Is what I'm doing helping the team? Is it unhelpful? And then how do I change it into something that might be more helpful? Is what
Instead
I'm,
of like you were saying,
Mhm.
good, bad,
Yeah,
but kind of like just assigning that value to what you're doing.
yeah.
I like it. Okay.
Like, oh, you write terrible code. Well, okay, thanks. But if you say like, okay, we were trying to push this patch, by Thursday, and the code you wrote wasn't helpful in getting us to that deadline. How can we maybe work on the skills that you need to be faster in your coding or have fewer errors in your coding? That's something that I can then start thinking about. I'm still going to feel hurt and embarrassed, but that's something that I can work on. That's a tangible takeaway. So helpful, unhelpful,
Okay.
effective, not effective, working, not working. Those are all things that are kind of moving us toward improvement. Um,
What about
yeah.
when it's feedback about how you're communicating or personally let's say you have a developer that just has a really off-putting
Yes,
personality and they're difficult to work with, but they write amazing code. Like it's just,
that happens a lot.
how would you address that as a manager, as a leader in a session, a review session to say like, because does that person then feel like they're being personally attacked for maybe their who they are?
Depends on the person,
Okay.
maybe. And so there's this one phrase that I think must have come out in a seminar somewhere, because within a 2-month phrase, I heard it from so many people. And that is managers telling their direct reports, I can't tell you who, but your team is really unhappy with your work. And that is terrible feedback for multiple reasons. One, like, what is wrong with what I'm doing? I don't know what to actually address. How do I measure if I'm improving? And two, managing the emotions of my team, whether or not they are happy, is not my job. So one of the things, if somebody is very abrasive, is like, it is not their job to be nice and fluffy. So some of that we have to shift our expectations of, you may not want to be friends with this person outside of work. Okay. But what we can expect is you need to be cordial and respectful. You can't be insulting people. You can't be ignoring deadlines. You can't be insubordinate. Those are things that can be addressed directly. And so that would be, I will say, when you're giving feedback, your metrics need to be concrete and measurable.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say people find you abrasive, okay, well, what concrete measurable thing am I supposed to change? When you walk in, it would be helpful if you said hello to everybody. This is a social norm we have in the office. It's an expectation we have to just greet people. Okay, that may be a dumb thing in your mind, but that's a clear expectation. I can measure whether or not I'm doing it. And
Yeah.
so when you're thinking about feedback, how do people measure it so that not only the boss knows that it's changing, but the individual themselves can measure if it's changing? And you might do all the concrete measurable things and people still find you abrasive. Okay, that might be the balance that we have to strike.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might not be someone who's chosen for more interactive tasks. You might just be given solitary things. And they may say, well, that's not fair because I'm so good. Okay, well, these other roles, part of the requirement is social skills and the ability to interact with people in ways that are constructive to the project. That's something we're still working on. And then give them tools. Do they need to go to a training? Do they want to change? That's a huge question. I'd rather just sit in my office, not deal with anybody and write code. Give me one person that I find less annoying, and I will talk to them. Okay, then that's their role. That's what they can do. If that works for your company, great. If it doesn't, you start talking about it's again like negotiating boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is taking me back to a time, gosh, it's been maybe 10 years ago when I was working at a software startup and my boss gave me a performance review and it wasn't very favorable. And I remember asking because they just delivered it. They said, "Here's your score." And I said,
Oh,
"Whoa, okay. Can you tell me why? Or can you tell me
great
what I can do
question.
better?" And they couldn't.
Mhm.
And it was this back and forth that actually happened over the course of a few days. And next thing I know, in my inbox, I have an updated performance review, and it's much better.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I thought, wow. But the reason why I was reminded of that is because actually you're saying this in all of your answers, which I really appreciate, especially with our audience who is largely in STEM. Taking it back to concrete and measurable,
Mhm.
where's the logic? Like how can I measure this? I want to get better, but how can I get better? And how can we measure it? Like give me something other than just you like me or you don't kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had a professor in grad school who was really big on like you have to have very clear rubrics for all of your scoring. Because there's a lot of professors that will read an essay and they're like, this is an 85 level work. Like, what makes it an 85? What makes a 95 a 95? I don't know how to improve. And then it becomes like, well, this is then at risk of just subjective bias. Did you have indigestion that day? So you didn't like what I had to say? Did you not like something I said to somebody in the hallway? And now this is coming back in a passive aggressive, weird outlet. That stuff happens. And so asking the question, I like that example of, why is my manager giving me this feedback? Is this designed to help me improve? Or there is a school of thought in business that not everyone holds, but enough people do, that negative feedback is required to instill anxiety. Because if you feel insecure, you're going to work harder and
Mm,
then you're going to make more money for the company. And so then your question can become, do I want to be in an environment that prefers my anxiety over my growth? Because anxiety, you will burn out and you will sort of be a disposable resource to the company. One that's investing in your growth, that's one I would prefer to stay at. And I have my own example of unhelpful feedback. So I worked at a clinic at one point, I won't say which one, where they started taking productivity metrics, is what they called it. So how many clients are you seeing? And the number they wanted us to reach was literally impossible with the number of meetings and other things that were expected of us. But they kept giving us this message of, you guys aren't doing enough. You're not doing enough. The metrics are too low. They're too low. I would have my one-on-ones. It's too low. It's too low. Uh, you're not doing enough. And I eventually left. And it was all de-identified information, but they would post it publicly of like, these are, shame on you all for not making the cut. When I left, the front desk staff took me aside and they said, do you want to know where you are? And I was like, I would love to know where I stand in this
mm,
public shaming process.
mhm.
But none of us know who it is, but we all feel it. Um, and she said, you were the top performer. I was like, well, I just spent 3 months hearing about how how poorly I was doing. And that experience really started to shift how I understood feedback. Like I was not performing poorly. I was doing really well, but that message was not one that they felt comfortable sharing, which really reinforced like many reasons why I left. Was like, I can't stay in an environment where you're never going to acknowledge that I am giving a good amount to you, because that's just going to run me dry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Isn't
that's
that wild?
wild.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's a story that so many people can resonate with to
Yeah.
some at some
I feel like so
level.
many people never get the satisfaction of like the fact check.
Yep.
And so they carry those narratives with them forever. And it's
Imposter
so
syndrome.
damaging.
It might, yeah,
Yes. That's the concrete data of like, well, I've been told I'm not good enough. So that's
exactly.
also when you're giving feedback, please give kind things. Like address the things that need to be addressed, but also highlight where people are doing well, because most people don't know where they're doing well at their job. And we can't have confidence or sort of anchor into, when we have confidence, we're much better at solving problems. Okay, I got this, I can do it. But if we're only highlighting all the negative, I was like, I don't even know where to start. Well, that guy over there, he's good. Maybe I should just go have him do it. And then we can't build successful experiences because we don't have the confidence. And so when we start giving people like, this is what you bring to the team, this is why we're glad you're here, that starts to attack imposter syndrome from the outside. It starts to give people confidence to move forward and to try doing hard things and to learn more in their field. And it's just a more cohesive environment for everyone to be in. Because like
Hmm.
when you're in a room with people who are like humble, but know their strengths, that is a much more fun environment to collaborate in.
Yes. And as you were talking about this, making sure to give that positive feedback, I see this being so important when you work in a remote setting because it's even
Yes.
easier to just get caught up in these messages of the mind of saying,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, I must not be doing good enough. I haven't heard from my boss in 3 days,
Yeah.
or I haven't,
Or this email felt terse. Maybe they're
yes.
mad at me. Did I
Mm-hmm.
do something wrong? Yeah.
Yeah, it's important. Okay,
Okay.
let's wrap up feedback. And okay, next we're going to move on to high sensitivity, which I know is in your wheelhouse. And I'm so excited that we're talking about this. I actually remember years ago when you recommended that I read the book, The Highly Sensitive Person
Yeah.
by Dr. Elaine Aron. And it changed so many things for me. It helped me it helped me have language and
Yes.
an understanding around certain traits that I have and characteristics because I very much resonate with being a highly sensitive person. So thank you for that. It's a fantastic book,
Yes.
fantastic read. Um, but one of the things I've always struggled with is how to navigate the workplace when it feels like my traits of high sensitivity are actually a weakness and not a
Mm.
strength. Like that's how it's kind of positioned at work. And I've been told so many times that I need to be more, like I need to talk more loudly or be more assertive or be more extroverted. And I'm like, but that's not
Not
who
who I
I
am.
am. It feels, it's just, I run into this issue where there's a push and pull
Mhm.
of being my authentic self versus doing what I need to do to get ahead in business or in my career. So, my question for you is many folks in our audience identify as introverted or highly sensitive. And I know that those are two different things, but I kind of wanted to lump them
Yeah.
together. So in a culture where often the literal loudest voice in the room is the strongest, what are some ways we can assert ourselves while also staying true to our
Mhm.
authentic selves and also appropriately conserving our energy?
Yes. And I appreciate your example that you're bringing in because I think we have to start with making peace with who we are. And when we know like that is not me, that changes again, like having a sense of agency and choosing how to move forward. Would it be easier if I was extroverted? Probably. Is that fair? No, nothing in life is fair, but it's what I got. It's the body I have. This is the personality I have. How do I move forward and figure out how to navigate these spaces? And you're right. In especially in American culture, extroversion and sort of the loud voice is really highly valued. And so it's again that imposter syndrome, that comparison mindset of if I don't have that, I am of less value. And we want to start to disrupt that. So it's not how do I become that person? It is how do I bring my value in? And some of the things that HSPs and introverts are particularly good at in business, sometimes people find them annoying. And so we have to understand like that's not about you, that is in part about the job itself.
Like what things?
So, like, if you are somebody who manages quality assurance for a company, you're checking things all the time, HSPs are really good at fine details and like noticing abnormalities, and like they may be on it. And then the company is like, yeah, but to fix this is going to cost money. And we'd rather just kind of risk it and not fix it. And the HSP is highly conscientious. They're like, that's against the rules. And so they get this pushback, and then people at work start avoiding them and not talking to them. And it feels retaliatory, it feels very personal. But really, it's a financial decision that they just don't want to deal with. And so, again, starting to see that as a problem that's not part of who you are, that is the role that you play at that company, people aren't going to like. And so, how do you want to navigate that? How do you want to document that you've spoken up so that when it comes back on you, you're like, not my monkey, not my circus. Like that is on you guys.
Mhm.
um, but it is something, it cycles back to imposter syndrome very quickly, right? Because again, I see myself as different. Now I'm getting these messages from other people that I'm different. And so maybe I just need to change who I am so that people will like me. And it's easy for us to dismiss that, but social belonging has been a survival mechanism for our species. So that pull is very strong. And so we want to acknowledge that when you feel that pull to change yourself to fit in, part of it is just a biological impulse. So again, having some empathy towards yourself. So going back to what HSPs are good at, we're very good at thinking deeply on complicated topics. We're good at being mindful leaders if we're given the time and space to do it. Identifying, preventing, and avoiding problems. Fine detail, subtleties, can be very creative problem solvers. And we tend to be good at fostering social harmony. Those are all things that are really good for the longevity and sustainability of a company, of a workforce, of a team. Here's the catch. In our culture, especially in STEM, there's sort of a pattern of people in higher up positions staying for 2 years or less. They want very concrete metrics of how they improve the bottom line of the company so that they can then leverage a higher paying position elsewhere. So they're moving around. The longevity and sustainability of the company is not typically a priority. Priority is quick measurables. That's where HSPs sometimes get stuck. Is like, I'm trying to create something lasting and solid and good, and this person who's in charge is not. And so you may be at sort of philosophical odds with the people that you're working with.
Oh, that's such a good way to say it. This is like such an aha moment for me because I have felt that way my entire career. It's like a philosophical thing for
Yeah.
me. You just put words to everything that I'm feeling, and I'm sure there's someone else out there nodding their head.
Yes.
Wow.
And so one of that is just be aware of that in those moments when people are telling you you should be different. They're sort of, they may or may not be imposing different values on you than what you actually hold. So sit with it, reflect on it. Maybe public speaking is something you want to get better at. You can do that and still be an HSP and introverted. So working on public speaking, working on increasing assertiveness, taking out the ways that we soften our language, the maybes, the could be, those things that maybe undercut what we're saying, and saying things more directly, building your confidence. Those are things that you can practice still within an authentic self. For some HSPs, like writing out your thoughts before a meeting can be really helpful so that you can reference it if you get overwhelmed. A lot of HSPs, we think in sort of layers. And so when we're with extroverts, they might be thinking very quickly and firing things off, and we're kind of digesting it, and our ideas may come a little bit later. So building up that confidence to be able to say, hey, can we just go back for a second? I wanted to follow up on something. Or being able to send up a follow-up email. I spent a day thinking about this. Here were some additional concerns I had. I wanted to put this out there so we can either address it before the next meeting or bring it to the next meeting, depending on your timelines. And then if you are managing someone who's highly sensitive, that can be difficult for non-sensitive leaders. But some things that you can do to make it feel a little bit safer and more inclusive is checking in with people at meetings like, hey, Kayla, did you have any more thoughts you wanted to add? Inviting like, okay, let's sit with this for a day. Anybody give me feedback by this time tomorrow in case there's additional thoughts. Otherwise, we're going to move forward. Just giving those little buffers where people can speak up. And then when you're giving them feedback, give them a heads up you want to give them feedback. Hey, do you have half hour tomorrow to talk about this one project? Talk about it and then have a follow-up of like, if you have additional concerns or like when you're having your annual review, let's go over the review and then let's set up something a couple days later to just check in to see if you had any questions or follow up on it. Because that's how HSPs digest. It's a little slower, it's a little more thorough, but it's really not so difficult to just be like, hey, check in, we're good. Okay, great, let's keep going. We're not good,
Yeah.
address it, and then keep going.
And if any manager out there who is willing to take those steps, if they're not an HSP and they're willing to do that for their team, that's amazing in my mind.
Yeah. Well, and they will ultimately end up being less frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have some more opening, I work with a lot of neurodivergent individuals. So people are very smart. We're often neurodivergent on so many ways to measure things in the brain, different on some level. And when you make space for people who are thinking differently, you get so much more value. And so it's these small payoffs are like, yeah, maybe this is a bit inconvenient for you, but if you can see the payoffs and the value in it, it stops feeling so inconvenient and it feels more like effective management.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thinking in layers also really resonates with me. And I have that same experience where I'm in the meeting. And this is a trend I've seen within meetings. A lot of people are allowing more time or making sure they
Yeah.
go around the table to get feedback from everyone, but that still doesn't cover what you're saying. The fact that some people may literally need more time to process beyond that meeting time. It's going to be
Yes.
an overnight thing for them. So going around the table, giving everyone a chance is good, but adding that additional layer of,
Yeah.
hey, let's keep this open until tomorrow. If you can, keep it open until
Yeah.
tomorrow. And then I really appreciate that as well.
Yeah. And that's something where if you're in a job that has really tight turnaround times for deadlines, that may not be possible. So then we go back to like negotiating
Sure.
boundaries and what's doable. But I also think HSPs would do well to build more trust in their own voice and their own intuition, because a lot of times we just assume whoever's talking confidently knows more. So just start asking, like, why do I assume this person knows more than I do?
Challenging your assumptions,
Yeah.
going back to that.
And sometimes there's a really like, yeah, they've been in this role for 10 years. They probably know more than I do. Great, give them the floor. But if they're just talking because they like talking, like maybe you also have equally good ideas and they're worth hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So good. Your book,
Yes.
The Empowered, Highly Sensitive Person, does that dive a little bit deeper into some of these aspects that we're talking about?
It dives a little bit deeper. There's some like self-reflection questions. Yeah. It's really interesting when you talk to HSPs about the book. It's like some people it's like this goes so deep and other people are like this is nothing. So it's depends on your perspective
Yeah.
and what you're needing.
I
Yeah.
don't have the book. I would love to read it.
I'll
I was
send you a
looking at it
copy.
on Amazon and I was like 900 plus reviews,
There's a
like
lot.
raving reviews. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
That was, I mean, for my own imposter syndrome, that was something I was like, I have to figure out how to take this in because
Yeah.
that's a good outcome.
That's very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
You did it.
Thank you. When I got the offer to write the book, my mindset was if this helps 5 people, it's worth writing.
Mm,
And so it greatly exceeded my expectations.
I love
Yeah.
it. That's wonderful. That's what it's all about. Okay. Let's pop on over to topic number 5. This is the last one we're going to wrap on. And feelings. We're just going to tackle feelings because we know emotional intelligence is really important in work, but also in life in general. And a big part of that is being able to identify and properly manage our own emotions. And sometimes that can be hard, especially for a person like me who feels all the feelings very deeply. And
Yes, at the
it's
same time.
at the same time, like just all of them. And it's a lot going on. And I've had to learn how to turn that off in certain moments, specifically at work. But that can also be tricky because often that results in actually suppressing my
Yeah.
feelings for the long term. And then I don't deal with those. And that can result in,
Like a
all
huge
kinds of stuff like,
backlog.
yeah, like you can even burn out and all kinds of
Mhm.
bad stuff can happen when we don't address our feelings. So my question for you is, it's often encouraged to suppress our feelings or certain feelings at
Mhm.
work because we need to just get the work done or, kind of focus. So in a busy world, when we know that our inner lives are taking a back burner to productivity when we're at work, what are some ways we can make sure our feelings are being felt and processed in a healthy manner while also appropriately managing them at work?
Yes. It's a big question. And I want to start with just acknowledging, again, starting from a place of empathy, we learn to suppress our feelings because it's a necessary survival skill, right? Feeling all of those feelings when you are about to get mauled by a tiger, not helpful. So we shove those down, do what we got to do to survive. What's difficult is so many things in our society sort of tell us to be in that state all the time. So many of us are functioning in a survival state the vast majority of the time. And so we suppress, we push it down, and it becomes our primary operating state, which is not healthy for us. The pressure starts to build up. Your emotions may start coming out in really weird and indirect ways. So the more you can kind of be present with them and feel them, the less that happens. And so understanding that emotions are kind of very basically, they're a biological response, helping us to process our environment and to regulate our nervous system back into homeostasis. And so like when we cry, we're releasing stress hormones. That is something that is helpful for the nervous system. It regulates us down. That can happen for good reasons. Our nervous system gets overwhelmed, for bad reasons. And it can happen a lot like when we're at work and we just feel overwhelmed and we feel stressed. HSPs especially, crying is a very effective tool. What's hard is a lot of people are very uncomfortable with tears. Are you expecting me to do something? Are you manipulating the situation? Or blah, blah, blah. We would all do better to just be a bit more comfortable with like, sometimes people need to cry, and that's fine. And I've worked with clients where we figure out how to just talk to your boss and say, like, when I get feedback, I tend to cry, but like, I'm fine. I'm in control of my emotions. It's not a big deal. And then they just kind of get used to it, and it's not a big deal anymore. It's like, if I do have a problem, I will speak up and say something. But like when I get nervous, sometimes I cry. We don't get to pick that. That's just our bodies doing what our bodies are supposed to do. And it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient to us. Sometimes it's very annoying to us or other people. But feeling shame about something you have no control over is pretty rough, right? So we want to work on regulating our emotions, being able to manage them, but also having some understanding for like our bodies are going to respond to things. So like we have to stay hydrated, right? Then we have to pee. Sometimes that's annoying. It's inconvenient timing, but it's also got to come out. And if we try to just hold it indefinitely, that's going to cause a lot of problems. So our biological processes have to run, and we can't hold them back simply because other people find it annoying. That's me saying I'm going to actively harm myself so that somebody else is not inconvenienced.
This example is 100% me. I cry often. I just do. It's like, and people get concerned. They get very concerned. Are you okay? And which, I mean, I understand, especially if you don't know me,
It's a very
but
kind response. Yeah.
yeah, I am okay. I just cry, and I can't, I've cried in meetings. I've cried, and I'm very fortunate to work with clients who are just beautiful people and understanding of all of these things. So we've just gotten to know each other now. But crying also doesn't mean yelling and screaming and throwing a fit on the ground. It just, like you said, it's literally, I have tears because I'm feeling something very deeply. I'm touched by a moment, and that's quite a beautiful thing if you think about it.
Yeah. That's different than crying in a dysregulated state, like a kid in a tantrum.
Yes.
And so if you are someone who's prone to get dysregulated really easily, therapy, there's other tools that help us learn how to regulate down so that it can just be kind of a simple offloading of those extra stress hormones. But depending on where you are in the journey, typically we'll want to start with just like, can you identify what you're feeling? Because most people, when they learn to suppress, and a lot of us learn this explicitly or implicitly growing up, And those messages are different based on gender, based on race, based on other diversity factors of what's permissible emotion and how you can show that. We learn to then start disconnecting from our bodies, from the ways that we feel it. And so it becomes really difficult to say what we're feeling, why we're feeling it. And if we can't identify those, then knowing how to respond becomes impossible. So we have to start very basically, just what are you feeling? What's being triggered in this moment? And then how do we want to kind of mindfully respond?
Mm-hmm.
And often we just know I feel bad, so I'm going to go avoid by doing something else, distract myself, or further suppress it. And those don't really help us in the long run. And then once we can label our emotions, we can start to ask, like, what do I need in this moment?
Yeah.
And it's going to drastically differ situation to situation, person to person. But that answer starts to inform us how to process the emotion. And sometimes when I start asking people, like, what do you need? Like, I need an apology from that person. It's important for us to recognize we can't control other people. You might need to speak your piece so that they know where you're coming from. And we can talk about the pros and cons of doing that and what your expectations are. But that's something tangible that you can act on. You might also need comfort from somebody. You might be really hungry and need to eat and sleep before you make any decisions. If you're angry, anger is one that we often really suppress, unless you're a man in the workplace, and then you're just passionate. But in general, it's one that we're all like, as a society, we can't do anger. But anger is a very functional emotion. Again, like, it's a boundary defense. Like, when somebody crosses our boundaries, we feel angry because we're trying to protect ourselves. And so what do we need to manage that? Do we need to address the boundary crossing in the first place? Or is it just a thing that, like, I need to go burn off some extra energy at the gym? High cardio while you're kind of processing something that made you angry can do wonders for just kind of releasing it from your body. So what do we need? And this moves us into a place where we start having a reaction, but we also have what's called metacognition, where we can have an understanding of what our reaction is and how we want to respond. Another way you can think about that is like kind of my very young child self having very pure natural emotions, and then like my adult self parenting that other part of myself. And it's now a conversation back and forth. What am I experiencing? How do I recognize it, validate it, and then compassionately respond to it? Because we don't get to pick our emotional response to things. We don't get to pick our bodies. We don't get to pick the hormones we were born into. We can do some things that maybe alter some of that, but like, I'm always going to be a highly sensitive person. I can do things to regulate my nervous system, to prevent disruptions, to care for myself well, but like, I'm always going to be affected by things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that compassionate response to ourselves is really helpful. And then therapy,
Yeah.
therapists, this is what we do. This is what we help people with. So
Yeah. You mentioned your child self, and I was in a group where actually the recommendation was to put a childhood photo of ourselves on our phone to kind of like connect us with that child self, and gain an appreciation for sometimes, like I said, I feel all the feelings all the time. And I know that 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 little girl also felt that way. And it
yeah.
kind of helps me to have more understanding and compassion for my adult self, to look at my child self and say, okay, I see where that came from or why, and it's going to be okay. And just to love myself even more. And then the other thing that you mentioned was exercise. And it's been a game changer for me. My thing is, I don't have anger, but I have anxiety. I mean, everyone has anger, but I have anxiety. I have anxiety like all the time, just like that's my baseline.
Yeah.
So
it's just extra like
extra energy, which is what I've learned. Yeah. And so like today, I didn't work out this morning. Usually I work out in the morning. I feel like I have extra energy that just needs to kind of be burned off. And it's really helped me with managing all of that, those anxious feelings. It doesn't go away. I still have a lot of
but it's more
mindset work
manageable.
to do. Yeah, but it's more manageable. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's, exercise. I work with a lot of people that have chronic illnesses or disabilities. And so it's a difficult topic. Like, how do you
Yeah.
access that? But simple walking can do a lot. For people who are bedbound, there are other exercises you can do to just kind of burn off energy because your body needs it. And sometimes it's not always satisfying. I've been through varying levels of pretty serious health conditions and had varying levels of activity. But working with a physical therapist that always helped me find some outlet for movement was life-saving. Like, it was so helpful. And that's, again, like burning off that anxiety because it just happens in life. Like, life is hard. Whatever circumstances you were born into, even for really privileged people, like, life is still hard because we still all have to face our own mortality. We all have to face that, like, we can't control things all the time, that things that we love and people we love change and come to an end, and nothing lasts forever. That's hard.
It's hard. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
always going to be. I was just talking with my daughter about this because she's had a lot of experiences this summer that have shown her that life is up and life is down. And that's what we talked about was there's no easy button for life. Like we're always going to have the ups and downs. That's the way that it goes. But when you have somebody that's there to support you and you know what those feelings are and how to more appropriately manage them, that's when it becomes, I don't want to say maybe easier, but it becomes
Less
easier,
scary.
less scary. That's a great way to say it.
And I think building that understanding of, like, this is hard, but I can do hard things. We help kids embed that into who they are when they're younger. That really helps build the ability to engage hard things in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. Okay. So that wraps up feelings, which wraps up our session here today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of your insights. It was so good. It was so good. I'm going to go and journal later today because I have so many good insights. Yeah. Okay, before we head out, I would love if you could share with the audience a little bit more about what you do and where they can find you.
Yes. So I mainly do therapy. Right now, I'm licensed in the state of California, working on some others that's not finalized yet. You can find me on my website at stempsychology.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at stempsychology. I'm not a consistent poster, but I do enjoy it. And then I have some workshops coming up that your audience may be interested in. Doing one on burnout on August 10th and one on imposter syndrome on September 14th. And so those are two big themes that come up a lot just working with people in STEM, especially minority identities in STEM, because there are higher rates of both of those for those communities. And so they're live workshops. I will be there teaching them. You can interact and ask questions. I tend to keep the group small so that it can be a more enjoyable experience for everybody. They can participate. And for anyone listening, if you enter Kayla10 at checkout, you're going to get 10% off.
Awesome.
I think that's everything. Yeah.
I will put that all in the description below the video as well, so folks can find that. And of course, your books, which we mentioned earlier, I will link those up as well. Thank you so much. It was great to have you here.
Thank you, Kayla.
All right. Take care.
You too.